All right. So welcome to our new day and time. So Mondays at 1 p.m. Pacific. So this will be our new time, at least for a little while. We'll see. But hopefully you've also been able to catch up on the videos that James has been uploading. Oops.
Yeah, so last time we had done a lot of stuff with the adapters, with the high-level adapters.
Right.
We finished modifying them to use our JSON HTTP client, and we left notes for ourselves about what we were going to do next.
Yes.
We should do that again. That was smart.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but I always try to do that. Like either have a failing test, or I tend not to like to leave things not compiling, but at least a failing test of some sort to figure out where to pick up.
So my favorite trick is I will always build myself a custom assert library that's unique to my project. And one of the things that I like to put in there is a to-do method. So I can say assert.todo and then put a message. And all that does is call assert.fail and then write the message to do and then the rest of it. But I love doing that. Like the best thing to do is to leave yourself a failing test that actually fails for a good reason.
Right. Yes.
But I cannot, like, it's so easy to make a failing test pass. The hard part's coming up with the test.
Right.
I find it so hard to not like, oh, well, I've done the hard part. Let me just get this in. And then I'm like, oh, crap, now I need to
right, yes.
leave myself a failing test.
Yeah.
It's like when I play Factorio, which is called Cracktorio for a reason. I start up the game and I just need to check one more thing. And then, of course, it's an hour and a half later before then I have to just check one more thing.
One more thing. Just one more.
Yeah.
That's what I use. That's what I use fail for. So I don't have fail comes with the assertion library. So I usually do fail, and then if it's not obvious, it'll be a message, and then that's the only time I'll ever use fail is basically as that sort of bookmark.
So something I do that I don't see a lot of other people doing is I always have a custom assert library, which is part of my project and that all of my tests use. And then that assert library just turns around and calls the framework of some sort, right? But I find myself putting all kinds of tests that are just specific to my code. Do you do that? I don't see very many people doing that. And it's such a useful trick.
Yeah, so AssertJ, which is the assertion library that we're using, has a way of generating basically custom assertions. So I've done that for some projects. The assertions for me, I tend not to do a lot of that kind of customization. I think it's just like I do it and it's so much nicer because it's speaking in the language of the domain. But it's a little bit of work. And so I tend to not do it as much as, like, usually the hard part for me about like reading and understanding the test is not the assertions, it's generally the setup, and the setup can get a bit verbose, and that's where I focus most of my energy on sort of refactoring. But I do it, and I do like it when I do it. I think it's just one of those. There's only so much I can sort of do.
You know, most of my custom assertions are just function calls in the test file itself. Right. So I'll be like assert blah blah blah, and it will just turn around and run an assertion.
Right.
But there's typically a handful, usually not very many, but typically a handful of things that. Well, here's a good example. So in my website, in my controllers, I need to. I'm actually rendering out. I render the page so that I can assert all the template logic is correct. So your templates will typically have an if or a loop or something like that, right? Well, that's code that needs to be tested.
Right.
There's also interpolation that needs to be tested.
Right.
So in one of my projects right now, I have a assert uses template, and what that does is that asserts that a particular HTML comment shows up when I use a particular page template. So I've got my master page template, but I have also got my internal page template. You know, there's all these different templates. So I'll say this page, assert uses template, and I'll pass in the page, and I'll pass in the name of the template, and it will search for that comment. So that kind of stuff is what I do as the custom assertions.
Right. Yeah, I think I don't know. I feel like assert is so fluent already that a lot of it is just really easy to read. But there's specific libraries for testing things like HTML. Like assert that page has, you know, a div with this content in it. So there's already some fairly high level things there. But I find it most useful in sort of more complex domain tests where it's like, okay, I can see what that asserts, but it's not really clear what the intent is.
Yeah, the other thing is that when I've got a code base that's been around for a long time, eventually I find myself wanting to change the underlying libraries, right? And the tests in particular tend to be really, really expensive to change. And I've never done this. I've always thought I need to wrap my test framework so I can swap it out. And my JavaScript code base, it's been around since 2012. So it's 11 years old at this point. And I have changed test frameworks on it 3 times. And that's not because the JavaScript ecosystem is, you know, flaky. It is if you're on the cutting edge, but you can choose not to be on the cutting edge, and it's just as stable as anything else. It's just that over time, the language has changed, and the right way to create tests has changed. So I've changed it 3 times, and I wish that I had like abstracted out the test framework. But I did abstract out the assertion library because I always use very simple, straightforward assertion libraries that are just basically static function calls. So that was very easy to abstract out, and that has been useful. Do I do it all the time? No, but is it something I would recommend for folks if they're embarking on a big project? Yeah, I think I would.
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about assert.j is it's compatible across JUnit 4 and JUnit 5, and it has also a whole bunch of modules that are specifically designed for, hey, if you're using this library, this popular library, like Guava was popular for a while. I don't use it anymore because a lot of the stuff is just like, I don't need it anymore. But it had specific things for that, and specific things for date time. Big Decimal is actually, so I actually contributed to it back when it was called this other library called Fest. 10 plus years ago. And so it's kind of nice that it's basically portable. Like it just calls assertion stuff underneath and does the right thing. So if you wanted to use a different library, but I think in Java, it's pretty much you're probably using JUnit for better or for worse, at least if you're in Java. Hey, Whiskey Sierra.
Yeah, glad you can make a whiskey. Yeah, so what we said we were going to do this time is we were going to make the game service nullable and then go into the controllers and see what that does for us. And then we were going to work on persistence. Yeah. I would love to get persistence today. I don't know if we're going to, but I think there's so many interesting conversations we're going to have about that once we get there.
Yeah.
So do you want to start working on making game service nullable?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So we've got a couple of tests. That looks familiar. Let's just get this first one to work.
All right. So what do we want to assert about this? We create null with die rolls.
So I think, let me just wrap my head around this again. So we've got this nulled responses, and we actually built that. And that's just a simple configuration object. So I think in our create null, well, let's see. First, we need to write the assertion, don't we?
I mean, we could simply assert not null to get us started.
I hate that. Like, I know. That's something that I hate it when people assert not null on something. It's like, oh God.
I'll do it sometimes when I'm like, I don't know what to do next, but I want something like to, almost like, it's like I finished something, let me write it down and then put a check mark next to it just to get it. But yeah, by itself, if it doesn't really drive you, then what's what's
And
it going to do?
so we need to tangent because it's been 14 minutes. It's been 3 minutes since our last tangent, and
Right.
so we need to have another tangent. Have you? I'm sure you've seen this, where people are being judged on their code coverage.
Yes.
And so what they'll do is they'll write
I actually work with a team where they are required to have 85% code coverage, and I'm like,
worst idea ever. Like,
and like, I understand the desire, but it's just the wrong approach.
It is the wrong approach. It is an absolute failure of management. I'm gonna put this real firm. If you as management are relying on extrinsic motivators, you have fundamentally understood the nature of knowledge work and you've fundamentally understood the nature of Agile.
Yep.
Extrinsic motivators kill intrinsic motivation.
Yep.
And they create bad results. It just does not work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I see these companies who have put stakes in the ground, like we have to have 85% code coverage, and then they have regular meetings. Boy, that's a great idea. Let's have another meeting. They have regular meetings to berate people who have not yet reached 85%. And so what do people do? They do the dumbest, stupidest thing they possibly can to reach 85%. They make their code harder to read. They make it harder to refactor, and they do not get any benefits from the code coverage because the way people program this, sorry, I'm ranting at you. This is not, apologize. The way they do this is they write the highest level test they can, and they assert null on the result or assert not null on the result. So now this test is going to fail whenever you make a significant change to the system, and it doesn't test anything at all, but it juices the numbers. Drives me crazy.
VDSL says Salesforce still automatically enforces 75% code coverage of the code its customers upload. I started working at one of those. So there are companies like Salesforce where it's actually built into their continuous integration systems, where it's like it'll reject it if the code coverage goes below a certain amount. And yeah, it forces people, like something that I demonstrate when I'm teaching TDD is like, look, if you code something a little bit ahead of what the test is asking for, it's covered, because in changing an equals to a plus equals, because you're accumulating instead of just storing, and it's like, look, you have now written more code than there's a test. I could change this code in a meaningful way by dropping the plus, and no test fails. Code coverage says I'm happy 100%. And I'm like, this code coverage doesn't mean assertion coverage. And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand, is like, no, all you've done is that line of code has been executed. Thank you very much. But you haven't asserted anything about whether it did it correctly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are just doing line coverage. They're not even doing branch coverage. But I think the example you're giving is perfect in that you can make meaningful changes to the logic, change a times to a divide, and you can break your code. And so I've got a confession. I do not know, for any of the code bases that I've built, I do not know what the code coverage is, because I have never figured out how to run a code coverage tool on it. Like, I would probably do it out of curiosity, but I've never been interested enough to actually invest the effort to get a code coverage tool running in the first place. And that's because it does not have value. If you're doing TDD properly, then by definition, everything you want to test has been tested because you wrote the test before you wrote the code.
Exactly. So I've actually run code coverage only because I've been interested, like, what is it? And also because people in my classes have asked, and it's discarding things like generated code like equals and hash code and stuff that you didn't write. It's 100%.
Of course it is.
And BDSL says, I sort of wish Salesforce would switch to mutation coverage. So there's a mutation coverage tool. No, mutation, not coverage. Well, mutation tool that basically in Java, and there are for other languages as well, will randomly, and not randomly, like in a very controlled, specific way, will run your tests, change some code, and then run your tests again. And if no tests fail, clearly, like, it just said, I'm going to return 0 all the time for this method. And if no tests fail, that's a problem. And I've run mutation testing on test-driven code, and as expected, it was actually like 97%. There was one place in like the front-end UI that actually didn't TDD. It's like, oh, of course it would fail there. But everywhere else, it was like, of course, because like you said, it's like and this is the hard part about TDD. I was tweeting about this the other day. Yep, whiskey PI test. Like this idea of it's so hard to write just enough code to make the test pass.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that is, I think, is what I've seen of people learning how to do it is, and I struggle is with this too, is like, can I write less? Can I write less than that?
Not to mention, if we're in ranting mode, which apparently I am, I'm sure, I know you saw the recent front page article on Hacker News about somebody who discovered a better way of doing TDD. I'm not even going to name the details.
Hacker News is a great source for getting me really angry and then going and writing something.
But there are so many people who to this day will swear up and down. I actually put it in my book as a cargo. I have all these cargo cult sidebar's, like, here are the common things people get wrong. And one of them is test-driven development is write all your tests and then write all your code. Like, how stupid is that? And then they say, this is dumb. It's like, let me turn to the dictionary, look up TDD, and you'll find a picture of a straw man right there. Yeah. That's what you've just done, is you've made up something and then said it was bad.
Yeah. Yeah, so I actually tweeted about that, and I said, just a reminder that test-driven development is one test at a time.
I saw that tweet, and I knew exactly what that was
and
from.
So that was like, oh, sure. And I mean, there's some interesting things that follow on to that. It's like, okay, can you think about tests, more tests? Of course. Can you even write them? Fine, just don't have them run. Like, some people, it's like, I can keep track of 3 tests running. And like, that's fine. But like, the focus is on just enough code to get that one test passing, then the next thing, and then the next thing. And that's where it's driving. And yeah, when I see stuff like that, it's like, it's great fodder for, oh, here's something that clearly people don't understand. And some of the discussion is always interesting, like because, for me, like, I want people to do TDD. And because I think it's the best way to develop, and I think you feel somewhat similarly, and figuring out how to attack and approach people who are coming from this place of, this is awful, this is a horrible way to do development, and what, I feel like I can only chip off little bits when I see these things and find something that I can sort of twist around and say, well, maybe think about this way, but like, there's this big mountain core that there's just going to be people who are just not going to do it.
Yeah. I mean, my colleague Diana Larson has a saying, which is that I'm not in the convincing business. And I 100% agree. Like, if you want to change the way you work, if you have a problem you want to solve, I can help you do that. If you want to come up to me and say in that sort of aggressive Hacker News, alpha geek style, I think TDD is terrible and you suck. I was like, okay, dude, see you later.
Right.
Like, I don't want to talk to you, because like, I'm happy to correct misunderstandings.
Exactly.
But, and I did that in that particular thread. And then somebody came along and said, no, TDD is this, and it's really, really bad. It's just like, didn't even engage, because what can you say to somebody like that?
Right.
I've had my fill of, somebody on the internet is wrong arguments.
Yeah.
And it's just not fun. All right, so let's do some programming.
let's do some TDD.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the thing here. So I don't want to do assert not all, in case that wasn't clear.
Yeah.
What we are effectively saying here is that we can configure the game service with a particular set of die roles. And if we're going to do a state-based test of this, then what we need to do is poke game service in a way that causes us to spit die roles back to us, so that we know that we got the right ones.
So it seems like one of these, perhaps this method might, so this one rolls the dice, and then this one gives us the last roll.
Well, that's perfect.
That's one possibility.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's it.
Yeah. So,
what is the purpose of last roll?
Mainly because I'm perhaps overly pedantic about separation of command and query. So this is a command, and then in order to find out what happened, you can find out through last roll.
I see. Instead of just returning it from roll dice.
Right, because basically its job is to create it and then hand it off to the game and say, here's the dice roll. Because I don't need it until I need to display it, and so that's why I have the separation.
We're going to have so many interesting conversations when we get to the architecture conversation, because I am just not on board with the command query separation. Like, I'm not opposed to it, but like you said several episodes ago that you really like it, like it's one of your foundational design principles, and I do not share that. So it's going to be really interesting, maybe when we get to that. But anyway, yeah, let's we've set up the game service. Let's roll the dice, and then we will see what dice were rolled.
So let's assign this. I love the default.
Yeah, Whiskey, I completely agree. So Whiskey is saying, I'm going to let you program, Ted, but Whiskey is saying that they feel like the majority of people rejecting X have never used or experienced it. And that's certainly my experience as well. I have no problem working with people. Like, if somebody has tried something and they did the real thing and it didn't work for them, I'm really interested in hearing about that. Like, I want to know, oh, that didn't work for you. Well, why not? What's unique about your situation that gave you a different experience from me? And then we can talk about, oh, well, maybe that means that a technique isn't appropriate in that situation or for that type of person. Like, some people who do pair programming have who I suggest do pair programming have severe social anxiety, and it genuinely does not work for that kind of person. I'm fine with that. But somebody comes up to me and says, pair programming is dumb because I don't want somebody sitting there and watching me code all day. I was like, well, A, that's not pair programming, and B, shut up and go away. I'm so tired of those folks.
Yeah, I mean, like it says, like, if somebody is clearly, they are not open to, they're not curious.
Mm-hmm.
So something I know I learned from Tim Ottinger a while back was sort of curiosity over judgment.
Yeah.
Like, tell me more about that. What do you mean? Like, because sometimes you're just not on the same page. Like, oh, pair programming sucks. Like, oh, not like you're stupid, but why does pair programming suck for you? And oh, because I'm tired of watching the junior developer make mistakes. Like, okay, and right, and then you can dive into that. But if somebody says no, pair programming sucks, why? Because it does. And then, okay, clearly there's not a dialogue. And if somebody is curious, like, I really hated TDD when I tried it, when I pair programmed, I said, are you open to trying it again? And we can talk about that. And it's like, sure, or not, or whatever. And that's why. So something I know G. Hill says a lot is, and I learned this myself from various people, is like, create experiences for people, because that's how you learn, period, is through experience.
And the reality is that when I'm in a consulting environment where I'm actually working with people, it's very easy to have that conversation. It's very easy to say, hey, let's try it out, or tell me about your experience. It's really the internet randos that are crazy making, because they're not, the ones who, it seems to me that there's a certain level of insecurity that ties into a high degree of absolute confidence and aggression. And those folks who have that insecurity that makes them ultra confident and aggressive in their confident ignorance, there's not a lot you can do to interact with those folks, because they will continue talking forever to prove how smart they are, but they will not listen. They will just look for they will look at what you say, and they will try to find something they can pick at to, again, prove how smart they are, which I am convinced comes from a position of insecurity. The folks who have some security and faith in themselves, they're willing to be wrong. And they're willing to listen and try new things. But some people online are not. Particularly on Hacker News.
All right. I think I've got a test.
Yeah. What is handofdice.stream? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So that returns the dice.stream.
Okay. What is a stream in Java? Is that
so basically it is a sequence of things that you read.
So if a hand of dice is always 5 dice, why do we need a sequence? Why is it not just the 5 dice or a list of 5 things?
Because hand of dice is already the unit of thing, and there's at some point you need to display the hand of dice. I could return a list.
You know what I would do here?
Yeah, what would you do?
I would do it differently because I agree with you. There's this idea of the law of Demeter, which is actually the context-specific guideline of the Demeter, the Demeter project.
Right.
But I do try to avoid returning the internals of a class, which is what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So the way I would assert this is I would actually make a new hand of dice that's what we expect and call dot equals to compare the two hands of dice. Is that possible?
I think so. Yeah, so the reason why this is exposed in this specific way is to A, not return the internals, B, provide a snapshot of the information. So for me, queries have all these requirements, right? It can't have side effects, so it must be safe. It can't return internals, and should really not return mutable things because that misleads the caller. But ultimately, you got to return something. And so I'd return stream because it indicates that this is a read only or read once really kind of thing, as opposed to a list, which in Java at least could be mutable. And so it's a little confusing. But I agree, since we've got equals defined, may as well use that. So let's do that.
I mean, that's so when I'm making a value object, I try as hard as I can to not return the internals. And actually, I'm usually able to succeed at that by going through some hoops. And one of those hoops is that I will implement equals on it. Of course, in Java, you do that by default. And then in all my assertions, I will create the thing that I expect and compare it to the value object rather than sucking out the contents and comparing to the contents.
Yeah, no, I actually do that most of the time as well. Like I'm really, to me, this is one of the fundamental parts of queries and encapsulation, is that you return and expose as little as possible, make everybody ask the object questions instead of saying, give me information, because then that leads to feature envy and then putting the logic somewhere else. And now you don't know what the heck is going on. What does, overbalance mean, because it's somewhere else outside of account. And so here, this would be more like what I should be doing. And so thanks for mentioning that.
I mean, that's part of the reason we pair, right?
Yeah.
So what happens when we run this test? Does it fail appropriately?
Well, we need to get it to compile. So what should I return here? Should I just return null? I could create I don't think we have enough to create the game service yet.
Yeah, just return null. I don't think we're going to see. I was thinking it'd be nice to get like a random set of die rolls back, but actually, yeah, go ahead and create the game service, but create it with the real things, and then we'll gradually implement those one at a time with the nullables.
So
with the null ones.
Oops, service. So score category notifier.
Yeah, but DSL, I agree. I've kind of gone off the law of Demeter. I tried doing it really aggressively in some code, and it led to some really interesting discoveries. But then when I re-implemented the same, and that project was in Java, and when I re-implemented the same project in JavaScript, I realized I could simplify it dramatically just by returning values. So I ended up doing that.
Yeah, I think law of Demeter's it's interesting to push on and use and think about, but I've also found it to be not terribly helpful.
Yeah, I had this Java project. It's called Let's Play TDD. It was my very first stream. It's on my site for free, and so this should fail with effectively random die rolls, unless we get really lucky. And in that project, I pushed law of Demeter really hard just to see what would happen. And so the domain objects render themselves. Like if you want to render something to the UI, instead of asking the domain object for its data, it says render yourself, and then it passes in this interface that is the thing that it can render to. And that was neat, and it led to some really neat designs, but overall it was overcomplicated.
So it did show us. So I want to point something out because this is something I like. And I'm pretty sure you do the same thing. Like watching a test fail in TDD, but making sure it's failing for the right reason. So this test is right now failing for the wrong reason. Yeah. It's failing because we've forgotten the protocol for a game service, which is in order to have a game in progress, we have to start one. So before we can roll the dice, we actually have to start. And so this is probably not a great error message. It should probably say game hasn't been started yet or something like that. But this is a toy application. And so now it fails because we got random dice as you predicted.
Yeah, I agree with you. I always like to see my test fail. And also when I'm doing like error messages and stuff, I will use the test failure to really tweak and fine tune the error message. Even if I'm just doing an assertion, I don't write tests for my assertions, my runtime assertions. But I will put a lot of runtime assertions in my code just to make sure that, especially in a big project, somebody is eventually going to come along and call your code inappropriately.
Yes.
So I'll put all kinds of assertions in to make sure that they are informed when they're called incorrectly.
Exactly.
And I won't write tests for that because it's for when a programmer make mistakes, and it's too much work. And it's a safety net anyway. But what I will do is I will modify my test to see that assertion come out, and I will look at it and I'll tweak it until it reads really clean, and then I will make the test pass properly. Right. Yeah, I love running tests and using the test failure to teach me about what I need to do.
Yeah, so that whole area of invariance and preconditions and things like that. Yeah, it's like especially at the innermost objects, making sure the object you asked it a valid question. You asked it to do something that needs to be valid. That those are actually enforced. If you can know about it, enforce it, throw an exception, because like you said, somebody could call it and not realize, and use it incorrectly. And it would be nice if it failed immediately and said, here's why it failed, instead of later on, hey, why was this thing null? Or why was this thing in the wrong state?
Yeah, I mean, that's called fail fast, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's incredibly valuable to fail fast.
Yeah.
BDSL in the comments say it's undefined behavior. I don't think it should be undefined behavior. I think it should fail when it's called inappropriately. And you will save your bacon. You'll save yourself so much heartache, and you'll save your team so much heartache if you make the effort to put in a lot of clear error messages.
Yeah, I think that's what BDSL is saying. It's like it should throw an exception, but that shouldn't be something that somebody looks for.
No. I mean,
that would be really bad. I've seen code that does that. Catch and look, it's like exception.
No, don't do that. Yeah, I agree with that. And this sort of gets back to something we talked about in one of our earlier episodes about, I actually really like the distinction JavaScript makes between runtime exceptions, which are programmer mistakes, and other exceptions, which are environmental issues that have to be dealt with. I think a runtime exception is a courtesy, but not something to ever rely on.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, the API is poorly designed, which often it is.
Yes.
So we've got this failing. So we should be able to make this pass just by changing dieroller.create to a create null and passing in the null response dot dieroles, which I don't believe we've implemented yet.
We did not provide access to it, so let's provide access to it. Because we've got our static class here. Let me just make sure it's failing. Actually, let's see. Oh, because it's accepting var args.
This is make an overload.
We could make an overload, or we could convert it to an array.
Either way is fine with me. I don't think there's anybody else who's going to need the overload. So
let's introduce a local variable. No, don't do that.
Actually, no. Let's go ahead and make an overload. I think it is certainly possible that we'll use it, and that seems like the right place to do it. But I
So
don't think this is something we need to put a test around.
yeah, so here we can do create null arrays to the array to list stuff in Java always throws me. What is it? Array.
Hold on one second. Scroll down. What data type is random stub create using? I think we might want to go the other direction.
It's also taking a var args.
We'll look at it down below though.
But it is assigning it to a list.
Yeah, so I think we should just have this take an array list and then do
converting the other way is easier. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, semantically what we actually want.
Mm-hmm. So let me roll this. Let me roll this back, and let's go and change this. So we're just gonna let's push this out to a parameter, and we'll call this values. Okay. We can get rid of this. And then we can push this out as the parameter. Oh, we'll call this values.
So what are you doing now? I'm a little bit confused.
As soon as it finishes it. So basically what I was doing, instead of manually changing it, I'm taking the wrapping of the conversion of the whatchamacallit. Oh, but we want to add a new method here.
Right.
Oh,
so
okay.
undo that last refactoring.
So the last step I didn't need to do. Okay, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Because we still want to have it take it as a...
Right, so now... so that's fine. So now we need the other method. Okay, so let's go back here.
So Whiskey says we need array list because as list is fixed size.
The consumer of it, though, is not modifying it, so I think that's okay. I'll look at that in a second.
Actually, your test should still pass, right? I don't think we are removing from it, Whiskey. I think we're using a index into it.
Yeah, so if we look at random stub,
yeah, we've got an index into it.
Yeah.
There's a current value.
Yeah. All right, so here, I'm just going to say $, random stub, the die rolls. We'll clean that up after.
Okay, and then line 23 should just call line 26.
That's what I was going to do, the cleanup after the test passed.
Yeah. And I do like the term die rolls rather than values.
I agree.
Line 21.
That's what I was going to change as well.
Yeah, Whiskey. I do a shift in the JavaScript code because it's convenient, but it was more convenient to use a cursor and index into the array in Java.
All right.
Okay, so now our tests are passing, and that includes the game service changes in place.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I want to point out what we're doing on line 21 and 35. These are tests I don't normally write, and the reason is that all of my tests are going to be calling GameService.createNull down the road,
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that seems like sufficient coverage.
Mm-hmm.
Now, admittedly, I'm doing this in JavaScript, so I don't have the nulled responses helper object,
Mm-hmm.
which gives things a little bit more weight and may make it worth doing the test. But typically, when I'm putting in a new null, create null method on a class, I'll just do it. Like
Mm-hmm.
I won't bother testing. I'll just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing for a create factory method. I'll just like everybody use it, and I won't
Right.
have specific tests around it.
Right.
So it's just something that occurred to me as we started doing this. We did it because we wanted to test drive the create null, but I don't know that I would do it if since create null is so simple, it's just turning around and calling. I'm going to be calling the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go ahead and finish up. Let's write the test on line 35.
All right.
And get that in. And then I think for the notifier, we'll probably just change that to be create null without explicitly putting a test around it, because I don't know that it adds that much value to have a test. Yeah, Whiskey, die roll was the first nullable we made, and I really like the way we did the iterator in average score fetcher, and I actually would want to sort of genericize that code a little bit. If I were to do it over again, I would probably create some sort of generic way of configuring that used streams, because we had that nice infinite stream. I don't know if you recall that. And then we had the finite stream. That was very nice. So I think that's a better way of doing it than using the index.
Let's see. So here we're just getting the the averages, and that takes a list of the score categories.
Yeah, BDSL, that's basically where I'm coming from. Create null is used so often in the tests that I'm really not worried about coverage of it. And it's not something, constructors in general are not something I usually put specific tests around.
Yeah. I mean, unless yeah, usually they're co-generated on the fly for me because I don't even write them. Like I'll write the test that needs to instantiate it, and then it's like, oh, that doesn't compile IntelliJ, please create it for me, and then it creates it. And so clearly I'm not testing that because I've already got other code to test.
Yeah, exactly.
So this returns.
Do we still need to do the GameService.start?
In this case, I don't believe we need to, because we're not referencing game.
Mm-hmm.
So assert that for category double map. Oh, this should really just be is equal to. We should pull out the map.
Yeah, Whiskey, I think you mentioned it, or maybe it was one of our other regular viewers who mentioned it when we were doing that it was worth making it generic. And I think I'm going to do that before I publish the final version of the article. I'm going to see if I can make a generic one and put that in the article as well. Probably not a Java version, just a JavaScript version, but I think it makes a lot of sense. It's only been recently that I've sort of established this pattern of the configurable responses having either a infinite stream of individual values or a finite stream of fixed values. That's a really useful thing to do, and it's just complicated enough to be worth having some generic code around. What's going on, Ted? You got an expression?
So the map that we pass in to the for the null responses is a map of the score category to integer. What we actually get back is a score category to double map. So I'm like, okay.
Oh crap! Yeah, that should have been a score category to a double, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
Whoops.
So let's go and fix that. So this is gonna be double.
There's no automatic refactoring to just say change the type of this.
There is. I just didn't do it because didn't think I needed to. All right.
So I guess that's not going to flow through. So that's good.
Okay. So that should. Well, that should fail.
Because it's not null. Yeah.
Because it tried to talk the real thing, which is
okay. Yeah, let's
deliberately not running.
Let's go ahead and change that to create null.
So that's the average score fetcher. Create null. So now it should fail because the map's going to be different.
Yeah, it's going to give us the defaults.
Yeah. Yeah, so we see the 42s there. And so now responses. Score responses.
That should have worked. Oh, do we not have the... We don't have the helper method, do we? Or the accessor method? Nice, Whiskey.
Wait, this is failing because...
Fetcher responses as null.
Why is...
That's weird.
So we're passing the map. That's our nulled responses.
Hold on one second. Can you just look at GameService for a moment for me? What is nulled responses dot average score returning, or averages for returning?
It should be returning this.
Show me. How is that even returning a value? Does it have access to the private variable?
It does have access to the private variable.
Okay.
That's how this worked.
Okay. So are we calling with average scores?
And we're calling with average scores here. So here it's being assigned.
So Whiskey makes a good point that our nulls on line 43 and 44
it's null by default. I could take it out, but it wouldn't matter.
No, it's just we need it to trigger the default case, which it should be doing. Like average score fetcher, if you go into there.
Oh, wait. So I know I was confused as to which test was failing.
Yeah.
This is... Okay, so it's this test that's failing. That's why I was confused, because I was like, when we specify it, it's fine. But you're right. When it's this should be an empty map, and then this should just replace it.
Well, hold on. Go into average score fetcher for me.
So what does average score fetcher require for its create null?
Like if we call create null with null, we really need it to set it to the default, because we don't want to do the default value inside of everybody who calls create null. We want it to be smart enough to figure that out itself. Yeah, it shouldn't be an issue, BDSL, because we specify the exact floats we want, so there's no calculations happening on them.
Yeah, so what's happening is this is null for the case where we haven't specified average scores, which what we'd want is for it to be getter default, but because fetcher responses is null, it just throws an exception as opposed to giving us this.
Let me show you what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
So you with me? This is effectively what I'm thinking. Oops, that's the wrong one. Here.
Ah, okay, sure.
Actually, that might even work. I mean, it's goofy,
Well,
but
what bugs me a little bit is it looks like somebody is explicitly passing null, and that just looks weird. I mean, this
it
would
comes.
certainly work.
Well, come back to game service.
But what I was thinking is in games, and I think is basically have this be the empty map here.
Well, but now everybody who uses average score fetcher, which right now is game service, but in the future there might be more people. Everybody who does that configuration has to remember and decide for themselves how to trigger the default. So that's what's bugging me is I want to just have a way of saying default. I don't like using null as an indicator.
Right, which is why I think we shouldn't allow null, and we should, if you want the default, you pass in an empty map.
What about for the die rolls? Empty list will
It's an
give us
empty
an error
list
saying that the list has run out. Maybe what we've discovered is that every one of our nullables needs a nulled responses.
So I guess for the die roller passing in die rolls, do we want to be able to say empty list means there are none? Because otherwise I would say empty list is...
Right now, if you pass in an empty list, it will throw an exception. So that's more logic we have to add to handle the case of to handle another default case. Actually, no, is that true? No, I think right now empty list does mean default.
Well, let's see.
Yeah, empty
Yeah.
list means go with the defaults. Okay, all right, you convinced me. So rather than using the null, we'll just have empty list, empty map.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if I do wonder if actually what in Java, where we've got a strong typing, what we need to have is have these taken a null responses type rather than these primitives. Just it crufts up the code a fair amount to do that.
So you're saying the create null should just take in this null responses?
And let me show you.
Yeah, maybe show me, because I'm not sure what you mean.
So what I'm saying is that inside of so let's see. What we would do is say something like this. With endpoints. I mean, it just adds noise for not a lot of value, but it does clean up our types. So that's what we'd have. I'm not convinced it's a good idea. But does address the problem, because now by default, the null responses initializes to default values, right? And then we can use whatever types we want to indicate those defaults. I'm going to put this back too, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting is like this is this is what I often do in my production code is I rarely am passing around these unconstrained raw maps and lists. It's like usually there's a type that they have meaning, and I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, and the thing is this is production code.
Well, yeah, I'm not saying. I mean, absolutely.
But that's something I say all the time is it is production code, but at the same time we've been treating it kind of like sloppy test code.
Yeah.
I don't know that I want to go back and change it right now, but it just makes me wonder. Like, it bugs me that the decision about what's a default is now smeared into two places. And every time we use average score fetcher.createNull, we're going to have this conversation again. Oh, how do we tell it the default? Whereas if what we could just pass in was the nulled responses,
right,
that's what we do.
And I think that would also address actually this, which seems to annoy Whiskey here and annoys me as well. Is like this logic feels like it couldn't be encapsulated, and then whatever the thing you specify, then it figures out and it knows. Do you mean we're empty? We should return some default, or do you mean we've run out and we should do this or that?
Yeah. And I think this is the thing. I don't know if you saw in the comments, Whiskey talked about making a generic configurator, and that's the kind of thing that could go in there.
Yeah.
I just don't know if I'm really looking forward to getting to the database. And I
think we could put this on the shelf and say this is something we'd probably want to do, but we'll focus on other things.
Yeah.
All right, so then here in game service, did that fix it? Yeah.
So I don't know if you saw, I changed the average score fetcher back. I have it no longer passing in null, which I agree. Passing in null as an explicit parameter is a bad idea.
Yeah.
I mean, returning null is something that I'm willing to do occasionally, although I like the get or default pattern better. Or in a more functional language saying get, and then you pass in a function that returns the default when it's null.
And Java has that with optional. Like I will never return null. I'll return an optional if it has meaning, and then you do the get or else or get or supply or whatever like that. Yeah.
Optional is yet another approach. But the one I'm talking about, let me just type in some code here for you for a second. The one I'm talking about looks like this. You say, let me put it somewhere where it doesn't completely mess up our syntax highlighting. You say foo.get, say it's a map, get with default, and then the key, and then 3 or calculation.
Right. Yeah, so there's the supplier pattern or the supplier functional interface in Java that basically does that. So there are different kinds of things like optionals and maps, and anywhere where you could get a null and you want to say, no, calculate it if it didn't have it, or do this other thing if it didn't have it. You can do
that pretty much resolves. So the one place I would return nulls is when I was getting something out of a collection and null meant it doesn't exist. And the thing of does it have it and then go get it is kind of clunky, especially in an expensive lookup, because you end up doing the lookup twice.
Right.
So just doing the get or default type of thing is a really nice compromise.
Yep.
Okay, so where are we at? We've got our create null, right?
We've got our, so this one's the only one that's left that's not create null.
And I don't think it's worth writing a test around that. We could, but I think let's just put create null on it.
Done.
Okay, let's check this in and take our break.
Yeah.
And then when we come back, we can look at, well, what I'd like to do is make the game service constructor private and then modify all of our existing tests to use the create null.
Good.
So I think what we were going to do next, we need to create a create factory, and then which is just going to call our existing game service. And then, well, no, actually it'll basically be the same as create null, except it will use the real versions of all of our dependencies rather than the null versions.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we need to test that. Not to mention it'd be really difficult because we'd have to set up our services and everything else.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay. So now I want to make game service constructor private. We could do that. We could sort of YOLO it and just follow the compiler failures, and the code base is small enough we could probably succeed at that. Or we could leave it public and we could do a find and just go through each one.
Well, you know what my preference is.
I presume you want to do it in small steps.
Yes, I'd like to do it in small steps.
Yeah, let's do that.
Since find
it's easy enough.
Since find usages works really well, we can just go through one by one. We can start at the top, which is actually the application itself, or we can start with just the tests.
No, let's just start at the top. We're going to change the whole thing over.
All right. Well, in this case, that's just going to be...
It's just going to be GameService.create, right?
Yeah. Since it's already doing the create. Oops.
Yeah.
That's what we want. That was easy. All right, so next. These are game service itself, and so the rest are in tests.
Okay, let's, because we've introduced a code path that is not tested, let's just quickly run the application, make sure we didn't break anything.
So let's run all the tests.
Does this have a smoke test around it that will tell us if it works?
It has at least tests that make sure that, and it does have one sort of smoke test. Let me actually...
Is that just because the service isn't running?
Yeah, let me actually go run the service. All right. Run that again. Okay.
And then if we just spin it up and see it show anything, then that should mean that it's working, right?
Yep.
Okay, good enough. Looks like it even fetched something from the service.
Yes. All right, great. So
okay, now we can do the tests.
Yep.
So yeah, I will typically in my code, I'll do a smoke test that does exactly what we just did.
Mm-hmm.
Like I won't even click anything. I'll just start it up, make sure it serves, and then.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure pretty sure. I mean, we could look, but I'm pretty sure I've got
something like that.
Yeah, because I test drive from the outside, so there's tests that actually make sure the endpoints are responding successfully. But still always good to run it. Okay, so now let's go.
Oh, before we do that, we are missing something. We need a create null that takes no parameters.
Ah, okay.
And all it needs to do is turn around and call our existing create null with a new nulled responses.
actually, I'm doing. So this one does that, and then it returns create null with responses. Okay.
Because we're going to be using this one a lot.
Right. All right. And so we were looking for usages of the constructor. Oh, it's this test on the left. So this one is using create null, create, and basically.
Yeah, that. So
Yeah.
I think we're going to see the same thing a bunch. We're going to replace this with a one-liner that is GameService.createNull, period.
Yep. Great. Oh. All right. And 2.
It's another example of why those setup helper methods are a good idea. Oh wait,
nope. That one is going to need the die roller. So we're going to have to say game service create null with a new null responses. That needs to be.
Hey, Kademlia, welcome.
Public.
So what we are doing here, welcome to everybody who just joined us. What we are doing here is we are implementing nullable response or nullable, the nullable infrastructure pattern.
Oh, it's a raid. Pattern. Sorry, I just noticed. Hey, Kademla, thanks for bringing your party of 64 folks over. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but I just want to recognize the raid.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we're implementing the nullables pattern. And what that means is that we have the ability to create a class in a null state where it doesn't talk out to the outside world. So we're building a program called Yacht, which is like Yahtzee. It talks to an external service to record stores and to get averages. And the game is run off of a class called GameService. Well, what we've just done is we've made the ability to make GameService nullable so that when you create a nulled version of the GameService, it does not actually talk to the outside services, which is helpful for testing because we don't want to talk to the outside services in most of our tests. So we've implemented a create null on it, which creates it in that nulled state. And now we're just going through and we're updating all of our old tests to use that new create null method, factory method.
And I'm having to make that public because those were not public.
Of course.
So now I can call with die rolls. And this is list of 6.
It's interesting we made the with die rolls not be an array.
Yeah, we haven't been terribly consistent about, because like the create null here takes either one, the width.
Yeah.
How do we feel about that?
I mean, for the average score fetcher, we use map.of.
Yeah, there we didn't have a choice because it wasn't just a list of things; it was an it was a map.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like the developer experience of being able to say 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So yeah, let's go with that.
Okay. So let's go and find. Let's go actually just do it.
So yeah, Whiskey, the helper method, the setup helper method, that's what I call signature shielding. And it's for exactly the reason that we're seeing here. That when you make a change that affects things in a big way, it's a little better in Java because of the automated refactorings that are available, but you want to be able to make one change per test file rather than one change per test. And having a helper method would do that. So you're going to make that an overload rather than just changing the type.
Yeah.
I think that's fine.
That's what I was looking for. Okay. Sorry, my machine is very laggy today. I have no idea what's up. I'm drooling over the M2 releases of the new MacBook Pros.
Yeah. I've got the M1 Mac. I think I've told you, and I really like it.
Yeah, I got my iMac. I got an iMac, which is, eight real Intel cores.
Yeah.
But so I'm waiting for them to revise the Mac Studio with the M2, because right now the new Mac Minis that they just released are on par with the Mac Studio.
Got it.
Okay, so that one is. Let's do this. Okay.
So these should all still pass, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm making sure. We'll go fix the other one. Yep.
Okay, good.
And then this one is all create.
Did you change on line 55? Did you get rid of that old die rolls?
Create. Yes.
Cool.
Okay. And same thing here. So it's going to be. All right. And this one's disabled.
So we should be able to fix this now. Because before it was saying use a hand-rolled mock or spy,
right.
but that should now, all of our nullables should make that work.
Let's do it. So
what is this doing? It's starting the game, it's rolling the dice, it's re-rolling.
So it's basically verifying that the reroll kept these dice.
Oh yeah, that's super easy to do with our new code. We'll just set up the die rolls we want, and then that's it.
So we would like, well, the die rolls don't matter as long as it has 1, 2, and 4. Do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
And then it's just do 6, 6, 6. And we should, or 6, 6, because it's going to re-roll 2 of them, right?
Correct. It's going to keep 3 and re-roll those.
The index is to keep are 1, 2, and 4. So is that going to be die rolls 2, 4, and 5? Is that 0 based?
That's a good question.
Oh, let's just try it and see.
So we don't need that. What we want, we just created it. And so this is our game service.
You need to introduce a variable on line 104.
I keep doing that. So we start the game, we roll a dice. We want to keep those. And this is that. We reroll. We don't need this at all.
And then what we should assert is that the game's last roll, I think, equals the dice we expect.
So that's equal to, should be 6, 6. So this is...
It's going to be a hand of dice.
Yeah, hand of dice. So new hand of dice. Actually, sorry. Hand of dice of 1,
So I'm going to guess that we're going to get
2, 4, 6, 6.
Well, we're keeping 1, 2, and 4. Yeah. Is that a set? Is it order free? Guess we'll find out.
I guess we'll find out. So let's re-enable this.
And I noticed that you've kept dice value in a variable.
Oh, that's what we should actually specify. Because we get the dice values from the last roll here. So actually that's what we need to assert against.
Well, I mean, we want to assert against both because the test name is keep dice rerolls the non-kept dice. So actually line 103, let's take off the using spy.
Yeah, I was going to remove that. Yeah, so what we want is actually a check.
We can just type in the value we're getting because we know that the value we know the
yeah
code
we know what we're getting.
So yeah, let's just put 23566 there, and I think that's good enough.
So I guess it is 0 based. Yeah, there's some. We don't need this.
Cool.
Yeah, that's something. Clearly, there's a little bit of a sharp edge there with the indexes. It's like, are those the actual things or the indexes?
So this is I think this is the first time we've seen a real world benefit to using the nullables. We were able to re-enable a test that you had commented out. I think that was quite old because you did have a step for dice rolls.
That was pre sort of separating out the die roll stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But still, I think that's the first proper test we've written with the Nullable game service. How did it feel from a developer experience perspective?
It's a little bit cleaner. There's less, so I didn't have to specify basically the collaborators that I didn't care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or even the null responses you don't care about. We just say with die rolls, and that's all that matters.
Yeah. And so basically, a little more concise about what do I specifically care about for this test.
Mm-hmm.
And I can also see some ways where it might be even made more, make it more clear what was the original role and what were sort of the additional numbers you're going to get. And that would be purely like code documentation as opposed to internally it would just still be one big list. But
we could. So right now game service is just passing through the die rolls. It gets straight to the random die roller.
Yeah.
For those of you watching, just joining us, we have this random die roller class that implements that has a nulled version that will give us exactly the dice roll we asked for rather than random values. And that will take a list of the values we want it to return. And so what we could do, Ted, is we could modify game service to not just take a list of values, but to say initial hand and then rerolls or something like that. I'm not sure if that would be a good idea because it's possible in our test we'll want to do like a hand of dice and then do something else and then another hand of dice. Like, I don't know how well that would actually translate, but I agree that it would be a lot more clear if it said with initial hand and then with rerolls.
Yes, yeah.
But
But that,
at
and
the same
that's
time.
yeah, and that's something I do when it does get more complex. So in my blackjack game, I've got quite a sophisticated data builder, especially when you got multiple players, and the way hands are dealt is not the. It's like you deal around and then you deal around again, and so it's mixed order of what you actually get. This is a simpler case, but in something like blackjack, that's where I found the builders and the natural. And then you can say the first player gets this, second player gets blackjack, dealer gets this other stuff.
That's nice. That is really nice.
Yeah.
I think the caution that you have to have there is when you're doing that, if you over constrain it, you make your tests really difficult to write. In that, let's say that you assume that, well, we're going to have this and then this and then this, but later on you modify it to say, well, we add a player in the middle of the game, right? And how do we specify that? It can get complicated.
All right, cool.
So should we just keep on going through our list?
Let's go back to game service and game service constructor. Yeah, so here there's again sort of this extra noise, which admittedly I could filter out and could create just a game service builder that hid all of this stuff. So like I did here with this method.
Right. So yeah, you do have the helper. So the nice thing here is that we should be able to just use that.
So this
and we could inline it, but actually I probably wouldn't. I would leave it as a helper.
And we want
new nulled responses.
Yep. With die rolls. Here that's convenient because we get those dies. Delete that. That should just work.
That should just work.
It does.
Nice. Let's change that from dies to die rolls, just to be consistent with our other code.
All right. I think though we had, so this used the create, this used the create. This one did not. So
and why didn't it? No good reason.
No good reason. Other than basically it just didn't care about anything.
But let's go ahead and let's use the create with die rolls for consistency, because when we come into this in the future, if we have additional changes, it would be nice for it to all have a single helper setup method. But we might want to rename that to just create game service.
So this one forces us to pass in the die rolls. Are you saying create another?
Oh, there's not one that there's not one that doesn't take anything.
No, there's only this one helper method.
Okay, well, let's just do GameService.createNull.
Yeah. Okay, and then here, this one takes.
Okay, so now we're going to need our average score fetcher.
Yeah, I feel like this is already using a utility method here, and I feel like the whole thing should just be put into a static method.
Yeah.
And then we'll push out the 12.
Well, wait, maybe we don't need that. Scroll down a little bit. So it's just looping through all the categories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and pull that out into a method. How about with average scores? Yeah, I like that.
And then we'll pull this 12 out.
How about score instead of average?
Well, it is an average.
Okay.
Average score. Then we're going to inline this. It's only used here. Yep, cool. Now I can push this down. Great. And this one.
Wait a second. That helper method you just made, we need to modify that to use GameService.createNull.
Oh, right. We didn't do that. We want this new average scores of
should just be map. But run the test because I'm not. I mean the types match up, so it should work, but I'm not 100%. Our semantics are the same there. Okay, good.
Yep. Yep. All right. That, and then this one is just create null. Yep.
I agree, Whiskey.
All right. Let's find more usages. Let's flip that over. Yeah, so this is. It's funny. So IntelliJ has this structural search and replace, what they call replace structurally, where we could do a search and replace that knows a little bit more about types and semantics but it's not the easiest thing to write those search and replace expressions.
It's a little scary doing that sort of thing too, because I guess the test would fail if we did it wrong. But
yeah, it's safer. It's safer than like a search and replace because it knows, hey, find me all where I'm creating a game service using a lambda here, and then I don't care for these other things, and then replace it with this other thing. So it's a bit more higher level, but it's tricky to get right. So we'll just go manually.
I can see that being useful on a larger code base than this one.
Yeah.
This one we
it's good
probably would spend
though.
as much time figuring it out as we would just brute forcing it, right?
Yeah. So here we're going to do create null, and then new that with barrels 35. Oops. Okay. All right. Our reroll tests. Yeah, this is pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to copy that.
Even the same random values. Interesting.
Well, there is a sequence, basically digits of pi.
There it is.
At least for the first up to here. Then it goes off. Okay, so that's that one. What's this one? Game service is hidden here. Okay, so there's just a create null.
Yeah, that's just a create null.
And then this one, I think is also just, it's also create null for some reason, though it didn't get refactored that way. Probably because there was a bunch of tests where it actually didn't care about the rolls, because all it cared about is the state of can you reroll.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and so that should work. And now we can go here.
Same thing.
Yep, same thing. Boy, my machine really is not happy today. Get that.
Oh, you need the game service on that one.
Yes, so let's put that out. And this one is the same thing. Yep.
Almost done.
Yeah. Now this one is
so I don't use the factories in my tests of the actual code. So these are tests of actual game service. So I don't use create or create null in those tests. I just call the constructor. In this case, it doesn't matter, but often the reason for that is that the create null operates at the semantic level of the callers, whereas my tests of the actual class operate at the semantic level of the class under test. So I want more finer grained control over the dependencies. So I will call the constructor directly and make it package private.
I'm sorry, I tracked the words, I didn't track the high level meaning.
I don't know. Well, actually, yeah, I think even in this case, it does matter. Maybe not for these specific tests, but GameService.createNull doesn't allow us to specify the average score fetcher or the die roller. It only allows us to specify the averages and the dice rolls.
Right.
But if we want to say something like score category notifier.track requests, we can't do that.
Right.
Now, anybody who's using game service, all those dependencies should be encapsulated. For them, they don't want to know how game service works. It just works.
Right.
But for our tests of game service, of course, we want to have finer grained control over the dependencies so we can test it properly.
Right.
So as a result, when I'm testing a class, I don't instantiate it with the factories. I instantiate it with the constructor so that I have fine grained control over the dependencies.
Right.
So even though we could use create null in this case and it would work, just following that sort of rule, I would not, because these are tests of game service, I would not use create null in these tests. GameService.createNull in these tests.
So why these? So these tests though are still. They're all creating nulls. They're all creating the nulls of the collaborators. So I could see if I wanted to do on average score fetcher that I wanted to track stuff because I wanted the lower level HTTP thing.
Well, something to keep in mind is that I do my tests a little differently than you do, and that I only have one test file per class, where you've got multiple tests.
Right.
Multiple test files per class.
Yeah.
And in that one test file, I have one setup helper method. So that's where I encapsulate the HTTP score category notifier.createNull and the average score fetcher.createNull and the die roller.createNull. And then from that, because I have the ability to return multiple values, I'll return the tracker, I'll return everything I care about. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's just convenient to, since I'm only instantiating it once for all my tests, I call the constructor because it's what gives me the most control.
Right.
But again, for this particular set of tests, yeah, we probably could call GameService.createNull. That's just not the way I tend to do things. I tend to use a setup helper method instead and inject my dependencies.
So I'm curious. I guess what I'm not following is what made these tests different from those other ones. Is it that this one is just is directly testing game service?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the people who use game service
Okay.
need to be unaware of the internal dependencies of game service.
Gotcha. Okay.
But the tests of game service, of course,
Right.
are aware
Right.
of the dependencies of game service.
Right. So like Whiskey Sierra said, we could at this point, because these are now in the same package, we could do this.
Yeah.
And that should still compile. Right. Right. And then so what I could do is create or would you, so since I like to split these things up, and that's, would it make sense then to have a game service creator, game service factory that's in the test package, test directory that does basically the...
Yeah, in fact, I would probably just steal the one you got elsewhere. Well, it would be a little bit different, but let me try for a second if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just take this and I would make game service equals game service with average scores of. Put that back for a second. I'll let you fix the formatting.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then that.
Right.
Keystroke for extract method.
Command Option M is in method.
Command Option N. Yeah, my IntelliJ is all kinds of messed up because that did not work. But
I can do it if you'd like.
I'm practically there already. Yeah, I'll let you clean that up.
All right. I'm going to clean it up by undoing and re-extracting because that way you can get the parameter types.
Let me undo that because otherwise you're going to do it one character at a time.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. All right. So extract method, and so we said this is
create game service with averages of or average scores of.
And then we can take this, choose parameter.
Interesting you do it that way. I always do it the other way around. First, I extract out the variable, and then I factor out the method.
So the reason why I do it this way is exactly what IntelliJ just did. Is it said, hey, I can now see a duplicate. So by introducing the parameter, it triggers IntelliJ to do process duplicates, and then does this. Nice. So then we'll just replace this. And it did that for us.
Very nice.
And I also do it because a lot of times I find myself when I extract the variable first and then I extract the method is then I inline the variable. And I'm like, oh, I
that is exactly what I do. I'll do extract, factor out method, inline.
Yeah. So
I will have to go through and I'll just do a sort of a manual cut and paste fix up for the other ones.
Yeah. So I find the other way of extract method and then introduce parameter for the things that I want to vary to be much cleaner, and then triggers the smartness of IntelliJ, at least in Java.
Yeah.
So, all right, so let's move this down.
Yeah, and again, in JavaScript, it's just not that smart because
it just doesn't have enough
doesn't
info.
have the types to give it confidence that it really knows what it's talking about.
Yeah.
So I've gotten to the point where I do a lot of stuff with search and replace. I'm like, I really only count on extract variable, inline variable, and extract method, or introduce variable, inline variable, and extract method and inline method.
Yeah.
Everything else I do manually.
Yeah, I always say, like, the only reason I'm still using Java is because of IntelliJ and its powerful refactorings, because it's like just some of this stuff, especially with larger code bases, is just so much easier. Swiss asks, does it work with multiple parameters? Yeah, you just extract parameter at a time, and once IntelliJ detects, oh, I now see that these multiple parameters can be replaced. I generally don't do it with many parameters, though. I find myself introducing one or two parameters, and that's pretty much it. All right, so let's run our tests. And the other ones are going to be in our other... Oh, well, that's the one we just did, right? Let me go ahead and inline this. And then die roller. And so we've already pulled out this. And yeah, so probably what the next step I would do is take these static methods and just move them to a game service factory. So these
But again, so if you had this all in one test file, then you wouldn't need that because there would only be the one. Because GameService.createNull is effectively a game service factory.
Right. So
Whiskey, that doesn't surprise me at all, just purely because of user base. They probably just put more money into Java than they do into Kotlin.
Oh, what am I doing?
What are you doing here?
What am I doing? What happened?
Oh, that should be notifier.createNull.
Yeah.
Score category notifier.createNull. I can never remember.
Come on. Complete.
Yeah, and you can inline that.
Yeah. And let's rename this.
I didn't realize JetBrains was the folks behind Kotlin.
Yeah, they basically created Kotlin because because IntelliJ is written in Java, because they wanted something better than Java, and this was many years ago that they...
Die rolls, I think, is what they've been doing here.
I always had that E. I don't know why.
Yeah. Die rolle.
Yeah, it's like I'm French or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
So they
Spanish, royer.
So they created Kotlin because they wanted a better language, and because they know a lot about parsing languages, they basically created the language and started having other people. It got its real boost from Google because Google doesn't want to use Java.
Yeah. Because
of their fight with Sun and Oracle.
I've heard a lot of good things about Kotlin.
Yeah, and so I would love to do more Kotlin, especially with its null safety. But yeah, for some reason, they spend a lot of money on Kotlin. I'm sure they get money from Google because Android Studio is based on Kotlin. I don't know why they don't spend, it would seem to me to be easier to do some of these refactorings in Kotlin because they wrote the language, but
yeah. Again, I think it just comes back to investment. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is also they've been doing this for Java much longer than they've been doing it for Kotlin. So stuff.
Yeah, that automatic discovery of the pattern, that's super clever.
Yeah.
That wasn't in there last time I used Java. So let's check this in.
I think there was one more. Yeah.
This is the notification test.
Right.
So this is doing it right. I would not change this right now. Because Yeah. This is a test of game service. I think it's fine that it's.
Oh, whoops. Right, we can't do that because it needs to track. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yep.
Why do we have HTTP score? Oh, yeah. Let's check this in, and then I really want to change HTTP score category notifier to just score category notifier.
Yeah. That was on my mind earlier when I'm like,
Yeah.
wait, what? Because it's the only
That
one
threw
that's
me for a
using.
moment
Because it's
because
the
I
only
was
one
like,
that's using
oh,
the interface. Yeah.
yeah. Is that a low-level client or
Yeah.
no?
Okay. Everything passes. Let's go ahead and commit. Stopped using constructor. I don't know. What do you want to say?
Yeah, all game service clients use factories.
All right. Yeah. So now score category notifier. So there's still the no ops. We could probably get rid of those because those were all So
they should all be
gone.
irrelevant at this point.
Yeah. So that was literally what was holding us back.
Oh,
Yeah. So now there's just the one
hey,
implementation.
Tramstars, welcome.
Tramstars. Late. It's late for you. Yeah. All right. Great. So then let's. So we want to not use.
So we should be able to eliminate score category notifier.
Yeah.
And replace it with HTTP score category notifier. And that to me feels like it should be. I remember us trying to do this before, and it wasn't a simple refactoring, even though it seems like it ought to be.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's like I'd like to sort of inline the interface.
Mm-hmm.
Will this do it? Inline superclass?
Oh,
Inline
try it.
reference. Let's see.
You checked in, so.
Well, look at that. That worked.
Oh,
or at least
so we were just
like
looking for the wrong refactoring.
Yeah. Yeah, I so rarely am doing the opposite way. That's like,
yeah.
I guess it's inline. All right, I learned something new. Yep, that all worked.
Okay, let's just rename it then.
Right, now we can rename it.
Yeah, before you check in.
Yeah, before I check in. This. And now we can rename it. Not that. Yeah, go ahead. Rename all those variables. And sure.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, unabstract. Yeah, it's like to get there, you would, if I had a class and I want to extract an interface, I'd basically say extract interface. And so I guess overload the concept of inline is a bit much, but as long as it does it. All right. So inline to remove score.
I mean, I think we did. We inlined HTTP score category notifier into score category notifier.
Yes, I guess you could inline any superclass. I
wonder if we could have done it the other way around. I wonder if we could have inlined HTTP score category notifier into score category notifier as one step and had it do the rename and everything.
We could try it.
I don't care that much.
I'll probably try it offline because we had that commit. So
Yeah.
that's what I mean. That's that's sort of my literal job is to figure out. And I sometimes call it refactoring golf. It's like, can I do this in one step? But it took 2 steps or 3 steps before.
Right.
Because then when I show it off in a class or in a talk, and they're like, "Oh my god, that's amazing!" It's like, yes, it took me like 3 days to figure this out. Because someone showed me how to inline a field, and it's like, I don't think of inlining a field, but it turns out that it does some stuff that I was doing manually, and it's like, oh my god, that's great.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, IntelliJ has still got the best refactoring support on the market. The other tools don't even come close. People who are in Microsoft shops are like, Visual Studio is amazing. It's like, are you kidding?
No, it's not. I mean, it's okay,
it's not.
But it's not amazing.
As evidenced by how many people jump ship to VS Code as soon as it was out, because VS was kind of the opposite of amazing.
Yeah.
All right. So I think what we have next is we're going to look at the controllers. But now's probably a good time to take our second break.
Yes, it's great timing for our second break.
Before we go on break, do you want to just look at what we've got coming up next? Oh, application port, is that go away now? Because I think we've removed all the ports.
It's gone.
Yeah. So we're not in A-frame architecture, but we're not exactly in hexagonal architecture either anymore, because it's literally ports and adapters, and all we have is adapters now.
It's just adapters. Okay.
So I said that the next thing we could do would be to modify our view controller and yacht controller tests. But I think maybe we've done that enough. I think the next thing to do is to start looking at databases.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to pull up the yacht controller reroll test real quick, just as an example, or any representative example of a controller test? Yeah, I mean, I think we could do some deck chair rearranging and like factoring out the builder methods, or but I don't think that's where the value is here. I think the next thing to do is to start working on the database. And I know at least one person's going to be happy about that.
Yeah.
All right, so stay tuned, everybody. As soon as we get back from the break, we're going to do database.
All righty. All right, we're back.
Okay. So before we get to the database, let's put a pin.
Sorry, I just have to laugh because it's like after the break we're gonna. But before, wait.
Well, just 1 minute, just 1 or 2 minutes. Normally at the end of the episode or the end of the session, we talk about impressions. How did things work out? But I think we're changing gears to something entirely new.
Yeah.
So you've seen the game service, the Nullable game service. We've gotten rid of the ports, and now we just have adapters. So, what are your final thoughts on how this works now that you've seen kind of the Nullables go all the way up to the top level, which is the controllers?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've really been thinking about a lot is what is, for hexagonal or ports and adapters, what is the purpose of ports?
Right.
Because I think that gets to the heart of what's going on here. And if your port is just for testing, like that you never ever, or when you do, you'd have to change the port anyway. So I saw a tweet from someone, I won't repeat who they are. They basically said, well, if you're just using ports and you never actually replace the thing behind it, or if you do replace the thing behind it, you have to change the port definition anyway. then I agree. Then I think this is cleaner. Then this makes more sense because they're coupled. So why just artificially separate them just for testing? You could use the nullables to do that in a very nice way. I think, and I'm playing around with some more of this, is if you actually do have a need for, I don't think databases qualifies. Everybody says, oh, great, you have an abstract database layer, you can switch to. It's like,
no, you're not.
I have in my entire career, did I do that? So I'll call it half a time I did that because we never actually finished it. Other than that, it was like, no. And so I did work on an application where we supported multiple databases at the same time. And that was different because then we weren't switching from one to another. We were always supporting all three of them.
But that's where you would want an interface.
Right. And so that is where you would want to port, because they all need to abide by some common interface, but you do need multiple implementations. And that, I think, is where you would want ports. And I think what I like about that is it's very much, you've created an abstraction and not a true abstraction, not sort of an artificial one-off abstraction. Somebody was mentioning to me in class the other day, I was saying, like, I have to have a good reason to use interfaces. I want at least, a couple of examples. And it's very much, you have three and you abstract. Although I think for if you have two here, you kind of need to, but you still need to abstract. It's like, if I'm using for text messaging service, I'm using Twilio and I'm using Vonage, two completely different things happening behind the scenes. But ultimately it has to be, send this text to this phone number and however you do it. And then having the port, what I'm not sure of, and maybe you and I will explore that, or I'll explore that on my own, is where would nullables and ports fit together? Like, where are the tests? So I'm not quite sure about that, but unless you need that as an actual abstraction, this is much cleaner.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear you say that, because I know you were skeptical when we first started. What you're saying sort of reflects part of the motivation behind nullables, which is that, it wasn't an issue in JavaScript because there are no interfaces in JavaScript.
Right.
But in statically typed languages or manifestly typed languages, it really bugs me. I want all of my code to tell me something about the program and the domain. And so when I've got an interface that doesn't tell me anything, like it has no semantics, like an interface to me says, I am something that can have multiple implementations. And if it doesn't have multiple implementations, then it has no real value.
Right.
Like, remember back in the day that Java, all the interfaces were named something able, like something was a serializable, or a, or a storable, or a fetchable, or, a whatever. I still like that. Like, an interface tells you that an object has a capability, and an object might have multiple capabilities. I want my interfaces to be part of my domain model, to tell me something about the real world that I'm modeling in my code. So it has always bothered me when people create interfaces simply to make their tests possible. That to me feels like it's perverting my code. It's making my code harder to understand, because now I've introduced noise. I don't actually have multiple implementations, but I still have an interface. I have to go figure it out. Like, my code uses the interface, but no, it's actually using this very one concrete implementation. So now I've got to find the code, find the interface, find the implementation, blah, 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 blah. I can't see, oh yeah, this is calling a service. I've got something that's pretending that I'm not calling a service, except I'm always calling a service. So I want to know I'm calling a service here. I think there are some interesting conversations to have around, what do you do when you have multiple implementations of the same interface, and how does that fit with the nullables?
Right.
But there's no reason why that doesn't work with nullables. Like, there's no conflict between having ports and having nullables. It's just that when you have nullables, meaningless ports are no longer necessary.
Right.
Like, we could have left them there,
right,
and the code would have worked just fine, but we didn't need it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing sometime, is plugging in some nullables into a more realistic application and see what that looks like in cases where I actually do have multiple real implementations of the ports. In some cases, and in some cases not. And my concern is the mixture confusing?
Yeah. When I have, let's say we've talked about this before. Let's say you've got multiple services that send a text message. You could do that with a port and multiple services, but now the decision about which service to use happens in your domain logic. So I would still have a high-level adapter that would be responsible for encapsulating the two low-level adapters for each service, and it would be making the decision about which one to use. So in that case, I still wouldn't use a port. I use interfaces again when it means something, when it tells me something about the domain. So that would be, if interfaces are sort of the polymorphism inheritance approach, and high-level adapter and low-level adapters is the composition approach, I would use composition over interface implementation in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. There's some practical things that happen when you're using certain frameworks where you supplying the implementation is sort of external to the code, or is specified in a way that it's not easy to do, and that it's only needed during configuration and startup, because I am in the West Coast region of the United States, and so therefore my closest and cheapest service that I'm going to use is this. I'm now in Europe, Western Europe, so I have a different service that I need to use, and I would never use the other one. In that case, it might make more sense.
Yeah, and that sort of comes down to high-level architecture. I don't think Nullables have turned out, and this wasn't intentional, but they've turned out to be extraordinarily design agnostic. So I think you could use them in anything.
Yeah.
What they give you the ability to do is say, oh, this piece of design I had is no longer necessary, but they don't prevent you from using whatever you want. Like you can use a dependency injection framework, but they were designed to work without a dependency injection framework. So they work with both. So yeah. Whiskey's got some good comments.
Yeah.
I would agree with the example you just gave, Ted. If I'm in an environment where it wants to do all the configuration sort of magically through a DI framework, and it's doing some sort of startup logic where it's making the decision, am I using, this CDN versus that CDN or whatever, then yeah, I would use an interface. I probably wouldn't call it a port, because that to me is just obfuscatory language. I would just call it an interface because that's what it is. But I would use an interface, and then I would have two implementations of that interface, and do it that way.
Yeah.
Or a high-level adapter. I mean, you could use.
Yeah, I mean, the high-level adapter. The sort of the flip side example of that is, time of day, right? From after 9 p.m. it's cheaper to use this other service, except on certain weekends, right? All this complex logic where it's like, actually now it's a much more sort of active decision making going on. Then I definitely have sort of a high level thing that composites or delegates then to other implementations.
Yeah. The example you're talking about is really more if you're configuring it on a server by server basis through environment variables or some other configuration mechanism.
Yeah.
But I find that, and we do need to get to the databases, but I find that people put way too much stuff in configuration and not enough stuff in code. And their configuration gets really complicated, and it gets to be, here there be dragons, and it becomes ops problem, which they don't really appreciate. We're making our lives easier at ops expense. If you've got a decision to make, and it's made programmatically and not as a business decision, and even if it's made as a business decision, that response to that decision, whether it's pulling the business decision out of a database, pulling it out of an environment variable, or doing some logic saying time of day, that doesn't belong in an undifferentiated mass of configuration at startup.
Yeah.
That actually belongs in a high-level adapter saying, my responsibility is sending text messages. I use these low-level services to do it. And all the code in here is about making that decision.
Yeah.
And when you first program it, it pulls it out of an environment variable. And then later on, when you change it to say at 9 a.m. I do this, you change in one spot and you don't have to worry about, all this complexity of how do we move it out of config and now into code, because it's always code.
Yeah, no, and I wholeheartedly agree. I think configuration, anecdotally, it seems like all the problems, big problems that systems have in failure mode is due to misconfiguration.
Oh yeah,
because it's much.
I read failure reports as a hobby because it's fun, and it's always we changed a config file or we changed a configuration variable.
And I also think that people overgeneralize, and that's maybe what you're addressing is sort of like, do we really need to? Can we just like write code? Like that's okay. Do we need to have, this, like there's like the situation that I'm talking about where it might be like a runtime startup. It needs to pull in a jar file that may not have been present in some other places. And I'm like, do you really want to have to troubleshoot that?
Yeah.
Like
and then they put in a default, and then it fails obscurely, and the default runs. Right. Oh god.
And the default one is a service that works, but it's very expensive. And like, what happened to our bill this month? And it's like, oh, this failed a month ago. We didn't notice it. And so there's a general sense of like, we must make things configurable. And it's like, great.
And generic. Like we're going to handle all future. We're going to handle all future problems. No, you're not.
And it's all that Yagni. Like, come on, you don't know when you do need it. Like, I'd much rather have an adapter making that decision based on a piece of information it got from a configuration variable, and not have the configuration like load in based on some text file on a path and happen to load in the right thing and you misspelled it.
Yeah, and that text file is written in YAML, and YAML, by the way, has magical deserialization logic, which has introduced a vulnerability into your system. Congratulations. Yeah, my very, very favorite configuration format, it's not YAML, it's constants in code. It's, if you take a file and you put in a whole bunch of static variables, that's configuration. But the neat thing about that is it's refactorable, it's testable. If I decide that now it needs to have logic, I can be dumb and simple and just change it into an accessor, or I can be sophisticated and smart and have it like turn into real code. But either way, I can do it right then and there. And I don't end up writing this god-awful mess of plain text code in YAML files and the equivalent. Find usages.
Well, because I mean, anytime it's code and not some random text file, even though it might say YAML on it or JSON or even properties, it's like
still code.
It's still code that you can compile and verify. I much rather have that.
Configuration is code. I completely agree. Whiskey and people punt on decisions all the time by turning code into configuration, but they don't make their lives better. So let's talk about databases.
All right. Speaking of configuration.
All right. So what are we going to do? You're kind of the customer on this, so tell us what we got.
So what I'd like to happen is so just a minor thing. Would you push this null response? Like, I feel like it's in the way up here. Would you?
I put it at the bottom.
Okay. Even though it's public, let's move it to the bottom.
Let's see how many other reasons we can find for not working on databases.
Last thing. At what point would you ever externalize this? So this is because it's specifically about configuring the null responses for game service. Having it nested makes a lot of sense. Okay. Just wanted to
this is one thing I would never make. And actually the syntax of new GameService.null responses is so pretty that I wouldn't even make it a separate file. I like having it or I wouldn't make it a non-inner because it just works really nicely. And I actually wonder if there's a general pattern here of every nullable in Java should just have a null responses for its configured responses.
All right. So what I'd like is instead of, so right now, game service is technically violating hexagonal architecture because it is holding on to a specific concrete instance of game.
So I'm going to stop you right there.
Well, can I modify what I just said before? Or go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
All right.
What I want to know is, as the customer, Ted, what behavior are we introducing to the yacht app?
Okay. What I want is to be able to have the server go up or down and not lose the state of the game.
Okay. So you want, so if we run the app, does that include having multiple users at once? Because right now I'm pretty sure that if multiple people come to the site at the same time, that they see the same game.
That would be my second follow-on request.
Okay. So actually, since we have no customers, it's okay that only one game at a time works. But that one customer needs to be able to see
we're doing an MVP, and we've got one big customer, our big enterprise customer.
Okay. It's just so this reminds me, I got to tell you this story. I worked for a company. I'm not going to name names because they'd probably sue me, but they don't even know I exist. It's a one of those gigantic Japanese consortiums. And back in 1998, there was a sales office in the US, and I won't say where because that might identify them. And they had a robotics control system that they wanted to sell for Intel to use in their fabs. Fabs, where they make their chips.
Yeah.
And what this does is it's in the clean room, it rolls around on overhead, and it comes down, picks stuff up, and it ships it off to another thing. And so that sales office decided that they were going to write software for Intel to control this robotic control unit, because the actual software was all in Japanese. So we're going to put an English language UI on top of this thing. And so they spun up a development team, and I had the dubious pleasure of being on this team. And we decided to do it with Corba. Corba is basically microservices of the 1990s.
That is so true. Yes. Oh God.
People have been reinventing this distributed systems wheel poorly for so many years. Let's see, it was Corba, and then it was SOAP, and then it was microservice. So we did it with Corba, and for some reason, the Japanese folks who came over were the ones who were in charge of building the UI microservice. So we had effectively 5 services. We had the UI, we had the read data in, we had the read data out, and we had the logic. Why we weren't just using the logic of the other lining system, I don't know. And then there was one that was the service discovery system.
Yep.
You could probably imagine how this failed. So we were doing classic waterfall. We actually literally had a plotter that was, many feet wide that would print out architecture documents. We were using rational rows. Rational rows is fantastic. You run it twice, it will delete entire methods if you do things wrong. Anyway, so we had all these diagrams on the wall. We had all this stuff. So we didn't actually try to integrate and make it all run together until a couple of weeks before it was time to demonstrate to Intel.
Oh, no.
It didn't work.
Well, of course not.
And it took us a couple of weeks to figure out why it didn't work. But it turned out that the network was completely saturated because we had put the input and the output on different services. And this was a stupidly simple little thing. Like, it did not need multiple CPUs. The logic was, it was classic. We've got 5 people working, and we're going to put each one on their own.
Conway.
They're all working.
Conway's law.
Yeah, it was Conway's law.
Yeah.
So it didn't work. So what was decided was that they were going to prop this zombie up like Weekends at Bernie's style, roll it out in front of the Intel folks for a sales meeting, say ta-da,
right,
and use the money from that sale to build something that actually worked. 1 client. 0 clients, actually. They didn't fall for it.
Yeah.
And that office was shut down. I found another job. And that job ended up being, actually, the job after that ended up being my first XP job. So if it wasn't for Intel, I wouldn't be here today.
All right.
Doing this.
And if it wasn't for Corba, then
thank God for Corba sucking so bad.
Yes.
So anyway, we have one customer. We're going to convince them that this yacht app is the best thing ever. We're going to get them to send us money so we can continue streaming every week and not do databases.
Right.
And
I feel like we're holding our audience ransom, but that's fine.
That's right. So anyway, so the feature that we're implementing is we're going to persist this. We don't care if there's multiple uses or not, but it would be silly not to support that at the same time because it's kind of the same problem.
It does add a slight additional. The reason why what's interesting is this is normally the way I actually add persistence is I'll start out with the one and only, there can only be one instance, persist that, because then the next step is you have to have identifiers, and then that sort of permeates out throughout the controller and into the domain a bit.
But as long as we don't use globals or singletons or anything else that encodes the fact that there's only one, we should be fine.
Yeah.
And you've done that already.
Yeah.
So in terms of implementing this, I would like to not modify game service. Instead, and that's because I think and rephrase this to be nicer because I'm just not a diplomatic person. I think game service is fundamentally flawed as an idea. But regardless, we're going to need some sort of adapter that talks to the database. I think we can implement that adapter, and then you and I can, duke it out, and you can convince me that game service is right, or I can convince you that it's wrong. But either way, we'll still use the same underlying adapter.
Okay.
So that's my thought: is let's build that adapter first.
Okay.
And then figure out how to get game service into it, involved with it.
All right, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
So, what's our first step? What do we want to do first?
So there's a couple of design questions we're going to have to resolve. Two come to mind. The first is that when we implement, we're going to have a high-level adapter that says basically persist the game service. We can implement that as a little monolith. So just like when we originally did average score fetcher, we just implemented it using the underlying Spring primitives. But we ended up later factoring out a low-level adapter, and that made things a lot cleaner.
Right.
So we could either implement the game service persistence adapter as a chunk, or we could say, no, let's actually implement a low-level database adapter first, and then implement the game service persistence high-level adapter on top of that. That's the first decision to make.
Okay.
And then the second decision to make is, well, what are we persisting and what's the model there? But I think the first discussion is more relevant to us right now.
So the way I would normally do this is I would create an interface for a repository that said save and load. And then the first implementation I would have of that would be an in-memory implementation, which would be trivial, but it would be a separate class that would get that implements that interface and would get loaded. Then I would create the real adapter, the concrete Spring Data adapter, which would then be responsible, or whatever mechanism that would then be responsible for transforming that into, I might use Spring Data JDBC, which is a really simple ORM, and then map over the domain objects, game and the hand, whatever that is, into whatever is convenient for storing in the database. With Spring, there is no low. You're not. I mean, especially if you're using the Spring Data JDBC or JPA, you don't see the SQL, you don't see the SQL. You pretty much.
I mean, it's going to be very similar to JSON HTTP client in that the low level is just the interface with Spring.
Yeah, basically.
And since we're not going to have multiple databases, are we going to do this with a fetcher and a notifier like you did with the services? Are we going to have
No,
a separate?
the database I qualify differently because its job is, and this is where I bring in domain-driven design concepts. Its job is to persist. A single repository is responsible for persisting an aggregate, and in the current game, the game is the aggregate. And so you might have multiple repositories, but each repository is doing save and then find of various different mechanisms that you need, minimum being find by ID, but you might have other ones.
Right. And initially we'll just have the load, which will get the one or not one row, but whatever the database structure is. So what I'm thinking is that then let's make a game repository. And let's not make a low-level adapter. We'll just use Spring Data directly in that game repository because we don't really have multiple repositories on the horizon. And it's something we can always factor out later when or if we do. So this brings us to the second question, which is, what is it that we're persisting? So in A-frame architecture, you would not pass the domain to the repository. Instead, you would use something like the memento pattern to basically have the application layer pass the data to the adapter. Now, that's not very much different than just passing the domain into the adapter and having the adapter pull out the data, but I just like the separation.
So I've done both, and I prefer the memento pattern because one of my goals in having a very clear and having the database being very separate, right? So there's a lot of folks what's like, why don't I just put annotations on my domain objects? It's because they're domain objects and they are supposed to be encapsulated and not reveal things or make it very hard to reveal things. Sometimes I feel like you're playing a guessing game. Like, are you true? Are you false? What? Right? So, whereas you need this side channel, which is what the memento is just what's the data inside of it that normally you wouldn't access through normal domain object interactions, but that the database does need because it's persisting the data, and so it needs access to it. And to me, those are there's tension there, and that's why I am pretty firm, and I've gotten into discussions about this, but I'm pretty firm about keeping my domain object model separate from whatever mechanism. It might look like another object model, but it's not a domain object model. For persisting in the database.
And just so that we're on the same page, and also for those watching, when you say memento pattern, what do you mean?
So some method that says, hey, game, give me your state. Give me your data. And it gives you basically a value object of, here's all the information that when you instantiate me again, I will have another constructor or creation method that takes that state, and I will be in exactly the same state I was when you saved it. And what's really interesting about that is it sidesteps problems I've had, which I look back and it's like, what was I thinking? So in one of my applications, and this happens a lot, is once you drive an object to a certain state, it's a state machine. And to get it back to that state, you have to drive it through that because there's no way to go from A to Z. You have to go A, B, C, D, Q.
And you've already got that. You have to start the game before you roll the dice, before you can re-roll the dice.
Right. And so, okay, you've rolled it how many times and what's the history of it? And it's like, no, just you don't, the database should not have to drive the domain in the same way that the domain does, in the same way the application does. And that's a mistake I've made.
Yeah, Clayton, the source code is up. There's a command to get the source code. I'll let Ted type that in. Whiskey, yeah, I was thinking that we would have an embedded stub in the repository. I don't do fakes. I feel like they're more work than an embedded stub. Because now if you've got a fake implementation, you've got to do all this work to make sure it actually matches the real behavior. And you have to do a little bit of work with embedded stubs to make sure they match the real behavior, but it's a lot less.
Yeah, I have standard sort of out of the box implementations that do a bunch of that.
Shouldn't be necessary with nullables, but we'll see what happens when we get to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so and then the other thing that I do with, and I don't know if this is the same way you do Memento, but um, is that the data chunk of data we pass in is the actual data that the domain operates on. Like it just keeps that reference in it as it mutates state. That's the state it's referencing. I don't copy the data out of the Memento into some other state. That's it. I just use it.
Yeah, I've done both, and the having a single reference that then is just the internal reference is just easier, instead of copying. There are some times
it's easier and it's a little bit cleaner because now you don't have to expose all this stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe we can make that. Well, no, records are immutable. Well, we'll get to it when we get to it.
Yeah.
So, do you have a memento that we can use for game right now?
I don't.
Okay.
So
I think that would be our first step.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. Where do you think we should go first here, Ted?
It depends. So, if we're going to go the Memento route, I think we got to create the Memento support inside a game.
Yeah, I do like the Memento approach a lot, and I think we're on the same page on that. I know people are really eager for us to get into the database, and so it would be possible for us to start on the adapter and sort of build the Memento, but the chances of us getting it wrong are greater than if we were to factor it out of the game first. So you've got the scoreboard, you've got the hand of dice, you've got the rolls, you've got whether the round is completed. That's basically our data, right?
Yeah.
Is the scoreboard a value object, or is it?
It is not, because it's the one that basically has the maps tracking. So when you do score as, it basically puts an entry into the map.
So that score map, that's effectively our memento for the scoreboard.
Yes. That's
for your I'm inclined to do a little bit of database design to start with, to look at our domain model and say, well, how are we going to map this to the database? Are we thinking multiple tables and multiple rows, or is this something where a single game can basically be a single row? Or is it a game is going to have multiple rounds? How much of this are we keeping? Is it current state or entire history?
I don't think I want to store entire history because the scoreboard isn't technically tracking that.
I wasn't talking about just the scoreboard. I sort of bounced back to the overall game design, database design. The scoreboard is the list of how we've scored.
Right. It's basically pretty much what you see.
And when we persist and restore, we want to, if we're in the middle of doing a die roll, we want to even get back to that exact state, right?
Yes. Yeah. So if you just rolled and then the computer went down and it comes back up, I want to see those rolls. It should be that you can re-roll, and whatever scores.
Can you pull up the game itself for a moment?
Yep.
I mean, we're lucky in that the game is really simple. I'm going to put a straw man out there, or a straw dog out there, and just say, go ahead and hit the roll dice. I think we could persist this all in one row. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I think we could.
I was going to suggest that. I mean, so one of we could make it easy to store in like a text file. If we basically did some serialization to text of this, which is what I'll sometimes
just serialize it out and
it's basically
store a blob.
Yeah, so basically the scoreboard, the score blob is just whether you optimize or not, it's basically are there any, for each category, what was the role? So it's basically just one big blob.
The decision about what to keep is purely client side, right? Like when you do the re-roll, it does the keep and then it re-rolls immediately.
Yes.
So if we persist in this, we need to have the scoreboard.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have the current dice, all 5 dice.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have how many rolls they've made.
Mm-hmm.
And that's everything, right?
Right. And so if I keep this again, re-roll. So now this state is I've rolled as much as I'm allowed to, but I haven't yet assigned it. Right. So that's what the
we could dump it out to a blob, but I actually think from a demonstrate using a database perspective, that's cheating.
Yeah, it's definitely cheating a bit.
Yeah, let's do it properly.
Yeah.
As I'm looking at this, even though we have a fixed number of categories, I'm actually thinking 2 tables, one for the overall game state and one for each average score. Or one for each score.
Each score in the scoreboard, yeah. That would be the next thing. Is the scoreboard is one table, and what's left is in the other. Yeah.
And then the scores are going to reference as back into the game. So we'll say category score.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit more generic, which I don't love unnecessary genericity, but in the database refactoring is harder. So I tend to be a little bit lean more towards, thinking it through ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got all kinds of data corruption issues that could come up. Like, well, what if we have 2 rows with the same category pointing back to the same game? What do we do now? Do we want to have a foreign key to a score categories table? Like, we could get really complicated with it. But I'd like to keep it simple, but not so simple that it's not real.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. So hand of dice, that we could stuff. I mean, even that, like, we could push out into another table, but I
don't think that's worth it.
I don't think that's worth it. So hand of dice is basically comma separated.
Yeah, I agree.
Rolls is really just a number. If you look,
rolls is how many rolls we've made.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Round completed is just a Boolean. And then the scoreboard is what you said is basically one
row for each score.
One row for each score in the scoreboard. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the question is the score category a separate table of its own? Because that's sort of the classic. Enums basically end up being a table of their own in a lot of databases. That's a good point, Whiskey. I assume you're talking about for the hand of dice.
Oh, Postgres does it right there. Yeah, honestly, we don't have to serialize that. We could just store that as a list and let the
that would be nicer.
You could defer that to Spring Data, let it figure it out.
Since this is an example, I do think we should have each score category I think we should have a table with the scores and categories in it, each with an ID and a string name. We should have the scoreboard, which has a row, which a foreign key to the game, a foreign key to the score category, and then the actual score, and then the game table.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's sort of where I'm leaning with this.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
We
should write that down.
I was about to say,
we're not going to remember any of this in a week.
I'm not going to remember it tomorrow. Let's sketch this out here. I'll put it in a separate file. So, okay. Where did I put that? I put that in the wrong place. Come on. Work with me here. There we go. Okay. All right, so we said, so game table. Let me now close that. This to the other side. And now I don't need that.
Well, let's capture our three tables. So we're going to have a game table, a score table. I don't know if it's scoreboard or score. And then a category. Score category, I think, is the table.
Yep. And so
and
this
the score
is...
category is going to have an ID and a string.
And game table is going to have, what do we say?
So yeah, the game table will have an ID for the game. Yeah.
That's boolean for included, int for nulls. Okay. And so score table is game ID, ID. Game ID.
Score category.
Score
ID.
ID.
And then the score, which will be an integer.
Yep. Oh, hand of dice. So some array. If one user of a million, we can model a round completed as a second game table.
Sorry, what was that?
No, I was just reading Whiskey Sierra's comments. Like, I think there's other things we'd want to optimize.
Crazy growth. That's right. That's how we're selling our one customer on this, our one angel investor, or sucker. Yeah. Are we missing anything?
Let's see. So we got that, and we've got this.
Do we want to highlight foreign keys? I mean, I guess we could just say that those are foreign keys.
Yeah. Yeah, Automod didn't like the FK.
Yeah. We're going to foreign key around and find out.
Oh, man. Yeah, so we got round completed, we got rolls, we got the hand of dice. Score table is the score.
So right. I don't think our memento should reflect this. I think it should be the job of our repository to convert our memento into the underlying compatible objects.
Yeah. The memento needs to be sort of friendly That was the way I think about it. Is like I don't want the database to have to parse scoreboard and figure out how it works, or figure out that it has to ask scoreboard for its memento. I want game to provide some kind of nice, friendly for persistence memento. Is basically, I guess, the way I think about it.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking is we've got the game, and then we'll have a scoreboard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are our, like, the game will have a scoreboard in it. And do you keep your mementos flat? How do you like to do it?
I like to. I don't know that I have a preference in this case. I don't think I'd keep. I don't think I do what you had. Basically, have two separate things to match a bit more closely what the object version of the table structure looks like.
Yeah. So what we're going to have is the game will have the round completed.
Mm-hmm.
It'll have the rolls. It'll have the hand of dice, and it'll have the scoreboard.
Mm-hmm.
And then the scoreboard will have the map of the scores.
Right.
And I'm going to fix these to be consistent.
Oh, yeah.
Been using this multi-cursor a lot more since I learned the keyboard shortcut. And this is going to be Boolean. This is going to be an array. This is going to be, oh no, that's just an int. This is going to be array. This is going to be a scoreboard.
Right.
And this will be a map. I think that's it. What are your thoughts?
So, so the game will need an additional piece of information, which is its identifier.
No, because we only have one game, right?
Oh, okay. So we're gonna basically have the repository assume that it's some constant.
Yeah. Well, I think what we'll have the repository do is it'll do a select, and if we get more than one row back, we blow up saying, error, too many angel investors.
That's never an error. Okay. Yeah. So internally, somebody will, we'll rely on the database to generate the IDs?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So those will be auto-generated then.
Yeah, I don't care what they are.
Yeah.
I mean, because we are expecting massive success, they should be a 64-bit int, not a 32-bit int. But other than that.
Oh yeah, always use big ints.
Yeah.
So score table. Yeah. That looks good.
Yeah. So our next steps, since we're out of time today.
Yeah.
I think we need to introduce the memento. And then we need to create the repository adapt class. Do you call a repository an adapter, or is that just a repository?
How is I just call it repository.
Yeah.
The implementation is the adapter, but the thing you talk to is the repository.
Well, again, we won't need a port. We won't need the thing. So, so that will be the game.
Okay, that'll be the
game repository adapter.
Yep.
And then, and that, I think, I don't think there's any need for us to expose the tables. These 3 tables are all going to be up to the game repository to abstract for us.
Yeah.
At some point, we're going to need to probably. We'll also want to create database tables. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we could do to demonstrate like proper database hygiene, but I don't actually think that's the interesting thing here. So
yeah, I was pretty much thinking that I would just do that offline, create the tables, create the database objects that represent how Spring Data needs to store it in those tables.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be
and
nice.
So I can provide that. I'll probably do that on a separate stream.
Okay. Yeah, great.
So,
yeah, because I don't think there's really interesting conversations there.
Yeah.
It's mostly just going through. Yeah, and I think you could do that actually before we introduce the memento, because we've got enough of our design figured out that that can just work.
Yep.
Yeah, I think this is good.
Yeah.
Introducing the memento doesn't seem like it's going to be a ton of work. Do you want to do that offline or in a separate
I can do
stream
that.
as well?
I was actually also thinking, because that's pretty mechanical.
Yeah.
So I'll also do that separately.
I think we're going to get to some of the more interesting discussions are going to be around how does the game repository work? How does this all fit together?
How does it interact, and how does it supposedly get rid of the need for a game service? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think Whiskey's made a really good point in the comments that this is going to be a massive success in 64 bits. Just only the number of atoms in the universe is not sufficient.
Well, trying to generate a monotonically increasing and unique identifier, and it's a lot easier if you use a UID generated on the client than in the database, because this is going to need all the databases in the world.
Right.
So it's a lot easier to just generate the UID.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh
man, how many people have we met that think they're going to be the next Google, only bigger than Google, and they design their code accordingly?
Too many.
Yeah, way too many.
And you see these in the just the smallest of places. Like, what do you do? What are you doing here? Like, what? Like, oh, because we might. And I'm like no.
I've got a client that has got a massive microservice architecture. We're talking about probably a couple hundred developers and more microservices than they have teams, and the teams are like 5 people each. And this is all to run effectively a vertical market customer-facing site and an internal like salesperson site. And if they get more than 1 hit a second, I'll be shocked.
Yeah.
I mean, they probably don't get more than, they probably peak around 5 or 10 hits a minute. They can run this on one box.
Right. And that's the thing, is like, it's expensive to run stuff in the cloud. I mean, I feel like people are just starting to get the sense that, oh, wow, the cloud is expensive. It's like, yes, you're paying for flexibility. Yeah. You're paying.
It's really expensive.
And like you run it all on one machine.
Yeah. Not only is it expensive in terms of just the operating costs, it's really expensive in terms of development costs.
Oh, yeah.
All the overhead that you spend on all of these teams coordinating with each other through a unreliable network interface is really, really expensive. But of course, the past 10 years, the fad was microservices, and everybody had to have microservices.
Yeah, they learned the absolute wrong lesson from microservices.
Yeah,
it
could be worse. It could be Corba.
I guess that's worse. Yeah.
Yeah, but is it really?
It's like,
sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
How much worse is that? I don't know. Anyway, so I was going to point out, like, Whiskey Sierra pointed out a problem where they had a single digit for a warehouse. Nobody envisioned. It's funny, like, I see those problems, but I see those so much less frequently than the overkill, overscaling, overgeneralizing like, I'd much rather have those kinds of problems as being like the popular problem versus all this other stuff, because all this other stuff just drags down productivity.
And the reality is, no sane programmer is going to use a single ASCII digit to represent a value.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
that just feels like, what are you doing?
We can choose to have a 64-bit primary key without overgeneralizing.
Yeah.
People remember the horror stories, but it's quite simple. Don't assume that you've got 2 bits, and don't assume that you need 3,000 computers.
Right.
Like,
right.
One computer, and then just don't paint yourself into a corner. Don't use globals. Don't use singletons. Don't use anything else that acts like a global. So singletons, monotypes, a lot of dependency injection frameworks. Like, just don't do global stuff, and write your code so that it can be changed, and then you'll be in good shape.
But that's the thing, is like, write your code so it can be changed, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what, you and I do, and not enough people do, and because everything is all about this fear of what if. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, if your code is changeable, then that's not a big deal.
Yeah. My number one design principle is to always ask myself, when I change this decision, how hard it's going to be.
Yeah.
So what Whiskey just said was that the ID was embedded in other entities' IDs. That was the mistake.
Yeah.
Because if you'd ask yourself, when I decide to change this ID structure, how hard is it going to be? It's going to be really freaking hard.
Yeah.
But if you'd chosen not to do that, then it wouldn't be hard. Like, why did we create the score category table? Because when we decide to change the names of the categories, that will be easy to change. But why did we not pull out the hand of dice into a table of its own with with one number?
Right.
Because when we decide to change that will be easy to change.
Yeah.
Like, the way it is now will be easy to change. It's
and I think a lot of it is
going to be to change.
Is coupling, right? So the example Whiskey Sierra uses is like, that's coupling. And like,
tight coupling.
And that's really tight coupling. And I'm happy to see that there's been a lot more, like, there's some really good talks about coupling, cohesion, and measuring it. And Kent Beck's been also talking about it, and some other folks.
His tidy first book, I think, is coming out soon, or has just come out. I need to read it. I love his stuff. He's so smart in terms of design. He's really good.
Well, just being able to sort of step back and observe and say, here's what's going on. Yeah. It's like, and like, really focusing on coupling, cohesion. Like, it's so funny, because I mean, I'm old enough that I read the structured programming books by Jordan and such, and like, this stuff is not new. There you go.
Check it out.
There you go.
Check it out. I don't know where I got
planned, this from, folks. This is reality.
No. And look at this. I just want to show this to you, Ted, just to prove my cred. There's a little flag here. And what is that chapter title?
Coupling.
And here's the other flag. And what's that chapter title? I don't know. I hope it's what I think it is. Oh, look at that.
Look at that. Cohesion.
Yeah, these are the fundamentals. I mean, the book actually is not that readable. But these are the fundamentals.
Yeah.
I put those flags in because when I talk about design in my book, in The Art of Agile Development, I say, really what you need to think about is coupling and cohesion. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to go back and find the original reference, and there you have it. Yeah,
I spent a whole lot of money on hardbacks. I don't know where you got that paperback from, but
I don't remember where I got it from. I've had it sitting around for a while because I know it's so foundational, right? Yeah. You can't buy it anymore. Like, you
can buy it at a used copy bookstore, but yeah.
I don't know if you saw the condition of that book, but I believe it is actually from the 70s.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, there's our time.
Yep.
This was fun.
This is great.
I'm really looking forward to getting into the databases.
Yeah, that'll be great. So I'll prep this, and so I will definitely do another stream just to do that. So in case y'all are interested, you can tune in for that. Otherwise, tune in at our new time next week. We'll pick it up from
4 p.m. Pacific.
Yep, and that's 9 p.m. UTC.
Yeah, and recordings, as always, are going to go up on my website, jamesshore.com/s/nullables-livestream. And if you go to that URL, there'll be a calendar invite you can download to get in your calendar, so you don't miss any of these scintillating discussions.
Yeah.
And speaking of scintillating, the book is called Structured Design by Jordan and Constantine, and it is the foundational book on software design.
Yeah, I always also like refer to Parnas, like modules decomposing, like, okay, some of the details have changed, but like that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Thanks everyone. We will see you next time.
Bye everyone.